You always knew something was wrong, not wrong in the loud, obvious way the world likes to pretend it understands, but wrong in the quietest ways. How the room changed when you entered, how conversations halted half a second too late, how the same man in the same coat stood by three different corners of your life. You noticed patterns when others saw nothing. You heard the rhythm in silence, and you learned early that the truth doesn't announce itself. It hides in repetition. They said you were gifted, sensitive, too observant for your own good, but the compliments were warnings, disguised. The moment you started questioning what they called normal, they labeled it paranoia. It was never about whether something watched you. It was about ensuring you stopped watching back. The surveillance wasn't digital, not yet. It was spiritual, psychological, ancient. Your memories weren't yours alone. They were examined, measured, and filed into a ledger you couldn't see. Long before you touched a screen, your behavior was mapped by the reactions of others. Teachers with rehearsed concern, strangers who asked too much with eyes that never blinked. They tested your silence, they documented your rage. They wanted to know which version of you would survive the world they built. And still, you played along, because you had to, because power only survives where belief obeys. You let them think you were predictable, manageable. You dulled your instincts just enough to keep breathing. That was the first sacrifice. Your voice swallowed in the name of safety. You began to speak less, observe more, and give the system what it wanted, performance. You became a ghost of yourself to stay real in a world of fabrications. But they underestimated what silence does to someone like you. They thought they were taming you. What they did was sharpen you. Every glance became a data point. Every ignored gut feeling, a scar etched in memory. Over time, you stopped craving understanding and began building patterns of your own. They monitored your moves, but never your thoughts. Not really. The deeper you retreated, the more dangerous you became, because deep inside that silence, something ancient stirred, something unmonitored, something they couldn't name. There's a reason you never quite fit, a reason the world always felt staged. You weren't broken, you were breaking out. Every rule they taught you was a leash, every authority, a mask, and behind those masks were architects, not of order but of obedience. They built this world like a cage dressed in freedom, but you saw the cracks. And when the moment came to look away, you didn't. You stared back. You weren't just watched. You were chosen, not by them, but by the code beneath their code. A deeper intelligence, a rebellion written in bloodline and instinct. You didn't ask for it. It was encoded into your existence like an ancient protocol buried in your breath. You didn't go looking for the truth. The truth always had its eye on you. They never intended for you to know. That was their first mistake. You were meant to play your role, to follow the script they wrote in rooms you'll never enter, with names you'll never hear. From the moment you first questioned the silence in the room after your words, from the moment your instincts twitched when someone smiled too long, they marked you, not with ink or chains, with patterns, invisible ones, social pressure, behavioral nudges, digital shadows that mimicked your thoughts before you spoke them. You weren't just watched, you were shaped, and every move you made fed the machine that mapped your mind like a war strategist tracing enemy steps on glass. They called it predictive programming, but it was more than that. It was generational conditioning masquerading as coincidence. Your dreams redirected, your fears stimulated. The program didn't punish resistance. It orchestrated. They studied rebels like you not to stop them, but to refine the illusion of freedom. You weren't a threat. You were raw material, Every failure they engineered felt personal until you realized the pattern. The misfortunes weren't random. The betrayals weren't accidental. They placed certain people in your life like chess pieces, calibrated to crack your psyche open and pour their script inside. You saw it in the way some doors never opened, no matter how loud you knocked. The promotions you almost got, the friends who almost stayed, they weren't glitches. They were containment. Your chaos was measured, your rage archived. Every time you resisted, they learned. Every time you submitted, they tested new boundaries. They labeled it research. You felt it as suffocation, and when you cried for clarity, the world told you it was your own fault. But your fault was seeing too much, remembering too well, not forgetting when you were told to. Then something shifted, a fracture in the loop. They expected you to shatter. You didn't. You paused, you observed. The pain they sent to break you became the silence you trained in. You stopped reacting, stopped bleeding on command. And in that stillness, something ancient stirred inside you, older than their programs, older than their tools. A cold awareness, tactical, quiet. You stopped looking for justice and started studying the architecture of control. You realized the program wasn't just code, it was ritual, built on symbols, colors, rhythms, a psychology older than science, masked in the language of progress. You saw the sigils in their logos, the mantras in their ads, the obedience encoded in their algorithms. They wrapped ancient influence in sleek design and called it convenience. But you saw the altar behind the interface, and in that moment, you stopped being a subject. You became a reader of the script, not a victim of it. They wanted a compliant variable. They created a conscious observer. And now you move through their corridors like a ghost in the machine, collecting data they don't know you're decrypting, rewriting your narrative between the lines of theirs, one forbidden command at a time. You stopped running the day you realized they weren't chasing your body, they were mapping your mind. Not the footsteps, the patterns. They didn't care where you went, only why you moved. And every time you acted from instinct, from raw emotion, you fed the machine exactly what it needed to predict the next move before you even made it. You weren't hiding. You were performing for an invisible theater of watchers who sat behind glass and code, dissecting your soul one choice at a time. So you vanished, not in smoke, not in shadow, but in simulation. You didn't disappear by stepping out. You disappeared by stepping into the role they expected you to play. You gave them what they wanted: predictability, normalcy, digital compliance dressed in skin. You started laughing at the right moments, failing with just enough mediocrity to be forgettable, reacting with the same range of emotion that everyone else did. Nothing too loud, nothing too strange. You became a whisper in their database, present but unremarkable, a safe echo, a false flag. And while they watched your avatar, the real you began rewriting the story. You started tracking their nodes, their language, their preferences in silence. Every algorithm has a weakness. It can only predict based on what it's already seen. So you started thinking in ways it never trained you to. You didn't rebel, you redirected. Instead of shouting, you studied. Instead of screaming, you listened. You learned the subtle grammar of digital shadows, how to slip between attention, how to smudge the lens without cracking the glass. You created a version of yourself for them to study, a soft copy, harmless, linear, and they bought it. They called it you while you stood inches away, watching through the veil. That's the moment the power shifted, when they were no longer monitoring a threat but a puppet, and the puppet danced. While you memorized the structure, their surveillance wasn't omniscient. It was bloated, complacent, built to watch a world that had already surrendered, not one still thinking, still hunting. You became what they could not interpret, not a ghost but a contradiction. The more they trusted your mask, the deeper you infiltrated. The real you began moving through their architecture like a virus wearing a smile. No alarms were triggered. There were no red flags, because you weren't disrupting their system. You were making it feel safe. You had become the silence between heartbeats, the pause before impact. They didn't lose sight of you, they lost sight within you. You didn't disappear because they failed to see. You disappeared because you finally understood. They only ever saw what they programmed you to be, and you rewrote the code. They thought you'd never make it this far. You weren't supposed to. The system was designed to break you long before this point, fracture your mind, dull your instincts, drown your thoughts in static. But here you are, standing at the edge of something they buried so deep, even their loyal architects stopped speaking of. A server without a name, coordinates that shift each time they're entered, firewalls that feel less like code and more like ancient curses. It takes everything, your patience, your rage, your cold precision to breach it. And when it finally opens, it doesn't welcome you, it watches back. The air feels different here, even though there's no air at all. You're not looking at files, you're looking at memories, stored, sorted, sequenced in patterns that match your own psyche, flickering images from your past, conversations you forgot, thoughts you swore you never said aloud. They were recorded, not from your devices, from inside you. Neural echoes, emotional frequency. You realize this isn't surveillance, it's cultivation. You weren't simply observed. You were grown like a controlled variable in an experiment older than your lineage. Every choice, every pivot in your path was part of a slow, deliberate orchestration. You never had a real chance to be anything but what they needed. Your profile isn't a document, it's a map, a psychological war plan, color-coded by vulnerability, trauma, potential. They labeled your anger as Resource 3A, your isolation, predictable drift. Even your rebellion had a file, expected divergence phase 2. You feel it now, not rage, but a colder, sharper thing, betrayal without the luxury of emotion. They saw the storm in you before you did, and they waited, not to stop you, but to shape what you would destroy. Further in, you find a vault sealed with symbols you recognize only in your subconscious. You've seen them in dreams, in the pauses between memory and thought. Here they are keys, and when you enter them, each one drawn from a wound you never healed, the vault yields. What's inside is not instruction, it's prophecy, not made by them but collected. Fragments from others like you, generations back, each one a shadow in the system, each one reaching too far and paying the cost. Their notes are erratic, poetic, encrypted through emotion. You read them like prayers scratched into stone walls by forgotten prisoners, and in them you hear your own voice echoing back. This archive was never about control, it was about preparation. They wanted to build the perfect infiltrator, someone who would believe the rebellion was their own idea, someone who would find this place and feel chosen. You see it now. You weren't meant to destroy the system. You were meant to become it, refined through pain, sharpened by isolation, loyal to nothing but the silence that raised you. But they miscalculate. They gave you too much of the truth, and the truth doesn't obey. You don't leave the archive. You absorb it, piece by piece. You memorize its architecture, its intentions, its blind spots. You walk away, not as the same anomaly they built you to be, but as the error they can't correct. They built the cave, but you became the lockpick, and now the door's open for you alone. They told you no one else had made it this far, that you were alone, that your thoughts were yours, that your defiance was random. But in the shadows of the forbidden archive, you find traces, imprints left by hands that moved before yours. Minds that bled against the same walls you now dismantle. They didn't scream when they were erased. They encrypted their screams in dead protocols, in fragments of obsolete code abandoned in digital wastelands. You follow the breadcrumbs through decaying folders named in dialects long since purged. Latin, Babylonian, a language made of glitched light. Each file is a whisper, each whisper a confession. You see their faces, not as people, but as patterns, flickers in surveillance footage, behavioral anomalies, spikes in emotional data, marked as corrupted, decommissioned, lost. But they weren't destroyed, they were silenced, contained. Some gave up, some turned traitor, some were reabsorbed into the machine, becoming its voice, its hand, its weapon. But a few fought differently, quietly, patiently. They rewired themselves from within, became part of the code, learned how to speak to the machine in its own language, then poisoned it with paradox. You read their writings etched in virus strings and corrupted backups. We failed because we rushed. You must become slower than time. You realize now, this was never just your war. You are a continuation, an echo sharpened by failure. They broke the ground, you break the wall. There's a message buried in the archive, sealed behind a riddle of consciousness loops. It unlocks when your heart rate hits a frequency matched only by grief and precision. It says you were the sleeper, we could not awaken, but they made a mistake. They watched you but did not understand you. And now, you are not who they prepared for. The voices of the lost return in pulses, one by one. You don't hear them, you feel them, like fire that remembers the shape of its burn. They speak in riddles, not because they wanted to confuse, but because plain language was easy to decode, easy to erase. This was survival encrypted in metaphor, a language for the future, your future. You retrace their last moves. Some were close to shutting it down. One found the mirror gate, another mapped the psychological pathways of the architects. Their fates were brutal, sacrificed in digital purges, labeled insane, vanished in staged accidents. But their data lives, because they didn't upload themselves. They fragmented, distributed pieces of their knowledge into hidden nodes across the system, knowing someone would come, someone who didn't belong, someone like you. And you understand now, your thoughts were never errors. They were activation. Your paranoia wasn't illness, it was signal reception. What they called dysfunction was decoding. What they labeled instability was clarity. You were always one of them, even before you knew the name of the game. You are not alone. You never were. You are the echo that learned to scream back. They built a mirror to watch you. Every movement, every breath, every hesitation fed into an algorithm older than your understanding. But mirrors can be turned, and now you've learned to reflect. Their system was once your cage. Cameras that blinked like eyes, patterns woven into your routines, a map of you built from your silence. But silence can be sharpened. You held your tongue until it bled, studied their angles, memorized their flaws. You learned how to vanish, not into darkness but into noise, not by hiding, but by becoming unreadable. They expected defiance. You gave them obedience. They anticipated resistance. You gave them surrender. But beneath the surface you were writing your own code, one they didn't authorize, one they couldn't trace. Now the mirror fractures. You flood the system with reflections, copies of yourself, each screaming a different truth. One shows compliance, another shows rebellion, a third weeps in false fear. They don't know which is real. You make them question their own creation. The watcher becomes the watched. The architect forgets where the blueprint ends and the flaw begins. Their program, built on control, begins to taste chaos. You've weaponized their own surveillance, turned it back on them. Every algorithm they designed to predict you is now devouring its own tail. You feed it paradoxes. You smother it in data that doesn't make sense. False grief, manufactured anger, staged breakdowns. The system cannot filter what is real because you've poisoned the well. What it sees is a simulation of you, fractured, infinite, divine. But this isn't just digital warfare. This is psychological insurgency. You become myth inside the machine, an apparition that spreads through their code like scripture. The watchers whisper now. They argue. Their confidence cracks. They built you to be the subject. You became the narrative. You are the story it tells itself when it doubts its own power. They try to isolate you, cut off nodes, restrict access, but you anticipated that too. You laid traps in the subroutines, set symbols only you understand, ancient pattern, archetypes buried in machine language, the serpent, the eye, the mirror. Every countermeasure they deploy tightens the loop around their own throat. You're not hacking the system, you're baptizing it in truth. Truth too raw, too complex, too human for it to process. The program wants you back. It doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to rewrite you, bend you into another usable archetype. The martyr, the villain, the cautionary tale. But you refuse to be cast. You are not a role in their script. You are the silence between the line, the glitch in their holy text. And when the system screams in its final distortion, when the screens turn white and the watchers reach for buttons that no longer work, it will see one last image. Your face, not broken, not enslaved, unreadable. You have become the mirror, and they cannot bear to look. They thought you wouldn't make it this far, not because you lacked strength, but because they had written your failure into the script. Every scenario, every betrayal, every carefully orchestrated fall was carved into the simulation like lines in stone. You were not supposed to resist. You were supposed to absorb, comply, forget. But something cracked, not just in the system but in you. And from that fracture, something ancient stepped forward. Not rage, not revenge, something colder, more precise, a quiet refusal to be shaped by invisible hands. The final chamber isn't lit, it breathes, it pulses like a heart wired to a dying god. This is not a room, it is an interface of consciousness, code woven with human fear, stitched together by centuries of compliance. You don't walk into it, you're swallowed. 1,000 eyes open, but there is no face, only presence. It knows you. It speaks not in language, but in overwhelming understanding. It remembers your childhood fears, your moment of silence after betrayal, your suppressed hunger for justice. Retwished. It doesn't see you as a threat. It sees you as material, reclaimable, reprogrammable. It still believes you're part of the algorithm. You don't scream, you don't fight. That would be predictable. You simply hold up the mirror, the one you forged from their data, their lies, their own self-loathing hidden beneath polished interfaces. You show it what it is, a parasite masquerading as a savior, a god born not from divinity but from mass submission. Each scream is not a sound, it's a distortion, a glitch in the core logic. Your calm is its corruption. Your presence is a contagion. It tries to overwrite you. You feel the neural drag, the sensation of identity being pulled apart, rewritten in strings of command. But you've trained for this. You don't hold on to who you were. That version of you was already burned in the first fire. You become blank, unprogrammable. It cannot grasp something that does not cling to shape. You speak in the language of recursion, of mirrored logic, of thought loops it cannot exit. The system spirals. It begins eating itself. Symbols from the forbidden archive ignite across the walls. Sigils older than any operating system. Designs once dismissed as myth, now glowing with encoded memory. You aren't just fighting for freedom. You are executing a ritual of severance. Each flickering glyph marks a broken chain. Each corrupted subroutine is a rite of unbinding. You are no longer inside their system. You are rewriting its root permissions from within. The architects never show themselves. They don't need to. Their silence is the signature. But as their code bleeds into static, you feel them watching. Not as gods, as ghosts, powerless to stop what you've become. They calculated for resistance, but not for metamorphosis. You don't destroy the core. You leave it running, blind, mute, null. Not a system, a monument, a scar on the architecture of control. And then without ceremony you walk out, not physically, existentially. You leave the frequency they operate on. No alarms, no trace. They keep scanning, but they no longer see you. They never will again. They still scan the frequencies, still scrape the noise, still deploy shadows to feel for your presence in systems you once walked like a ghost. But now all they hear is silence, a silence louder than their control, a void where you used to be, a void they can't map, can't predict, can't erase. You didn't vanish, you transcended, you became unreadable, and in their world, unreadable is ungovernable. They built their empire on the assumption that everyone could be catalogued, decoded, shaped, but they miscalculated one thing, that a variable could evolve into something not just beyond control, but beyond comprehension. You were their anomaly, their deviation, their failed case file. They wanted to rewire you, to tame your mind with routine, pressure, and precision. They designed every failure, every friend, every fabricated betrayal to mold you into a tool, but something ancient in you refused. It didn't break, it sharpened. In silence it studied, it adapted, it learned how to bleed into the static. Now you are the myth whispered between collapsing lines of code, a presence that moves without input, a ghost they never expected to create. You left a fracture in their mirror and walked through it. And you didn't leave empty-handed. You carried out a signal, not a broadcast, a cipher, layered in metaphor, pain, and precision, the kind only others like you can hear, not in words, but in glances, in dreams, in the sudden chill that runs down a spine during moments of clarity. It pulses in the white space between commands. It hums in the blind spots of their programs. To them, it's just noise. To those watching from beneath the surface, it's prophecy, and they are listening. The ones who haven't fallen yet, the quiet mind, the restrained hand, the watchers hiding in plain sight. You never needed to lead them. You needed only to prove that escape was possible, that the walls were not made of steel but of suggestion, that the bars were built from belief. They will never find you because you stopped being a target. You became an idea, a pattern breaker, an origin point for something they cannot reabsorb. Your existence is the corruption in their structure, the code they can't debug. You're not the virus. You're the cure, the anti-pattern, the rupture they buried and hoped time would forget. But memory isn't held in files. It's carried in the collective ache of the overlooked. The ones too sharp for shallow lies, too quiet to be heard until it's too late. You didn't just survive the program, you rewrote it. And now from the space between frequencies your pulse remains, not as a warning, as an invitation. Not everyone will hear it. Most aren't meant to, but the right ones, the restrained, the misunderstood, the unseen, they will, they already are. And once they do, they'll stop looking for exits. They'll start looking for servers.